On July 27th, 1917, Henry Ford incorporated a new company. He was the most famous manufacturer on earth. He built the Model T. He revolutionized mass production. 2 years earlier, a clerk in Mini application, that single sheet of paper legally barred Henry Ford from putting his own name on a tractor. He had to invent a new brand. He chose Fordson. The machine he built captured 75% of the global market. It also crushed its operators to death. In 1900, American agriculture ran on muscle, horses, mules, men. There were 21 million draft animals in the United States. They required daily care. They required constant feed. 1/4 of every cultivated acre went solely to feeding the horses that plowed it. Mechanical power existed. It was massive. Steam traction engines weighed 20,000 pounds. They cost $3,000. In today's money, over $100,000. They required a crew of 3 men, an engineer, a fireman, a steering man. They burned coal, they burned wood, they sank deep into soft dirt. They were useless for cultivating row crops. They were built for threshing grain. The average American farmer owned 100 acres. He could not afford a steam engine. He relied on horses. Henry Ford hated horses. He grew up on a farm in Spring Wells Township, Michigan. He was born in 1863. He despised farm chores. The physical labor was endless. The profit margins were thin. He left the farm at 16. He walked to Detroit. He became a machinist. He built cars. He built an industrial empire. By 1815, his factories produced 300,000 cars a year. He never forgot the farm. He wanted to lift the burden of flesh and blood off the American farmer. He wanted to build a mechanical mule. His engineers began experimenting in 1907. They called it an automobile plow. They took a copper-jacketed 4-cylinder engine. They mounted it on a heavy steel frame. They used rear drive wheels from a grain binder. They used front steering wheels from a road grader. It ran. It was heavy. It was highly impractical. Ford shelved the project. He focused entirely on the Model T. The Model T debuted in 1908. It changed the world. Farmers bought them. Farmers modified them. They stripped the rear axles. They attached saw blades. They attached plows. Ford watched this happen. The rural demand for mechanical power was undeniable. In 1915, Ford returned to the tractor project. He assigned his best engineers Eugene Farkas, Charles Sorensen. They worked in a brick building in Dearborn. They discarded the automobile plow concept. Farkas proposed a radical idea. He wanted to eliminate the heavy steel frame and tire. He bolted the cast iron engine block, the transmission housing, and the rear axle directly together. The powertrain became the chassis. It was called a unit block design. It drastically reduced weight. It reduced manufacturing costs. It was a masterpiece of engineering efficiency. It became the architectural blueprint for almost all future tractors. Ford was ready to launch. He hit a legal wall. In 1915, a businessman named W. Bear saw an opportunity. Bear hired a young man in Minneapolis. The young man's name was Paul Ford. Paul Ford knew nothing about tractors. He was a residential electrician. Bear formed the Ford Tractor Company. He paid Paul Ford simply for the use of his surname. The company built a deeply flawed machine. It had 2 front wheels and 1 rear drive wheel. They sold stock. They defrauded investors. They secured the federal trademark. Henry Ford tried to buy the name. Bear demanded $1 million. Henry Ford refused. He incorporated Henry Ford and Son. He shortened the brand name. He stamped the word Fordson on the radiator. The timing was critical. World War I raged across Europe. German U-boats sank British supply ships in the Atlantic. Britain faced mass starvation. The British government desperately needed to grow domestic wheat. They drafted able-bodied men to the trenches. They requisitioned farm horses for the artillery. They needed tractors to plow the fields. In 1917, the British Ministry of Munitions contacted Ford. They tested his Dearborn prototype. It weighed 2,500 pounds. It produced 20 horsepower at the belt. It produced 10 horsepower at the drawbar. It ran on cheap kerosene. It was light. It was agile. The British government immediately placed an order. They ordered 6,000 tractors. The Fordson Model F went into mass production. Ford built a new factory. He built it on the Rouge River in Dearborn. The River Rouge plant, it was massive. Raw iron ore entered one end of the complex. Finished tractors rolled out the other. Production began in October 1917. The first 254 tractors shipped to England in December. The war ended in November 1918. Ford pivoted instantly to the domestic market. The Model F debuted in the United States. The initial price was $750. In today's money, about $15,000. It was a fraction of the cost of competing machines. Farmers bought them by the trainload. In 1918, Ford built 34,000 tractors. In 1918, he built 100,000. By 1920, the Fordson accounted for half of all tractors sold in America. The tractor had a 4-cylinder engine. It had a 3-speed transmission. It had steel wheels with heavy cleats. It had no battery. It used a low-tension magno. The farmer had to crank it by hand. It was difficult to start. It ran hot. It burned oil. The farmers did not care. It replaced 3 horses. It ran all day. The Fordson Model F used a thermosiphon cooling system. It held 12 gallons of water. It had no water pump. The radiant heat of the engine circulated the coolant. Under heavy load, the water boiled. The cast iron radiator steamed constantly. The air washer system was entirely unique. It used water to filter dust from the intake air. If the water ran low, the engine inhaled raw field dirt. The cylinder scored. The piston rings failed. Farmers learned to carry extra water. In 1920, the post-war agricultural boom collapsed. Crop prices plummeted. Wheat dropped from $2.15 a bushel to $1.44. Farmers stopped buying equipment. Tractor inventory piled up at dealerships. Competitors like International Harvester and John Deere panicked. Ford did not panic. He applied his automotive strategy. He ruthlessly cut the price. In 1921, he dropped the price from $795 to $620. In 1922, he dropped it to $395. The competition bled cash. International Harvester sold tractors below cost just to survive. Dozens of small tractor companies went bankrupt. The industry consolidated. By 1923, Fordson held 77% of the U.S. market. The tractor was cheap. It was ubiquitous. And underneath the cast iron transmission housing, it hit a catastrophic mechanical flaw. The Fordson Model F used an underslung worm gear drive. The worm gear sat at the bottom of the differential housing. It drove a large brass worm wheel. The engine sent torque through the transmission. The transmission turned the worm gear. The worm gear turned the rear axle. It was mechanically efficient. It allowed for 11 inches of ground clearance. It also created a leaf lever. A farmer drove into a field. He pulled a 2-bottom plow. The steel plowshares cut through the soil. They snagged on a submerged limestone rock. The tractor stopped moving forward. The 20-horsepower engine did not stall. The worm gear continued to spin. The rear wheels locked against the earth. The laws of physics took over. The rotational force had to go somewhere. The torque transferred from the axle back into the chassis. The entire chassis rotated around the rear axle. The front wheels lifted off the ground. It happened fast. It took less than 3 seconds. The 2,500-pound machine pivoted vertically. It flipped entirely upside down. It crushed the steering wheel. It crushed the operator. By 1922, agricultural boards compiled the data. Records indicated 136 men died. They were pinned under hot cast iron. Hundreds more suffered broken pelvises and crushed ribs. The word spread across the Midwest. Farmers called it the mechanical widowmaker. Henry Ford received the injury reports. He refused to recall the tractor. He refused to redesign the transmission. He blamed the operators. He stated they used improper hitches. He stated they drove recklessly. Independent inventors saw the problem. They built aftermarket solutions. The Hertzley safety hitch hit the market. It cost $15. If the front end lifted, the hitch automatically decoupled the plow. The tractor dropped safely back to earth. Ford engineers knew about the hitch. Henry Ford forbade its inclusion as standard equipment. Ford forced the flawed machines onto his dealers. A man wanted a franchise to sell Model T cars. Ford required him to stock Fordson tractors. Many car dealers operate in urban centers. They have no rural customers. They park the tractors on city sidewalks. They sold them at deep discounts. They sold them at a loss. They needed to move inventory to keep their automotive contracts. This destroyed independent tractor dealerships. A specialized farm equipment dealer could not compete with a desperate Ford car dealer. The specialized dealers went bankrupt, International Harvester watched this happen. Alexander Legg ran International Harvester. Legg was a hardened executive. He saw the $395 Fordson. He knew his own Titan 1.0. 2.0 tractor cost $900 to build. Legg made a brutal decision. He cut the Titan price to $700. He lost $200 on every sale. He threw in a free plow. International Harvester lost $5 million in a single quarter. In today's money, over $19 million, Legg kept the factories running. He bled cash to keep his dealers alive. He bought time for his engineers. His engineers delivered a weapon. In 1924, International Harvester released the Farmall. It looked like a steel insect. It had tall, narrow rear wheels. It had two front wheels bolted tightly together. It was a tricycle design. It offered 30 inches of ground clearance. The Fordson offered 11 inches. The Fordson plowed. The Farmall cultivated. A Fordson axle dragged through growing corn stalks. A Farmall drove cleanly over them. The Farmall introduced a new feature, the power takeoff, the PTO. It was a spline steel shaft. It protruded from the rear differential. It transferred engine power directly to trailing implements. It powered mechanical mowers. It powered grain binders. The farmer no longer relied on ground-driven wheels. The Fordson Model F had no PTO. Farmers noticed the difference. Sales numbers shifted. Farmall production in 1924, 200 units. In 1926, 4,000 units. By 1930, 42,000 units. Fordson sales plummeted. Ford built 104,000 tractors in 1925. He built 10,000 in 1927. The River Rouge tractor assembly line went silent. Dealerships begged for a redesigned model. Ford ignored them. He was focused on cars. The Model T was obsolete. Chevrolet was taking market share. Ford retooled his massive factories. He developed the Model A. The tractor division became a distraction. In 1928, Henry Ford issued a directive. He halted all tractor production in the United States. Finished. He shipped the factory tooling across the Atlantic Ocean. He sent it to Cork, Ireland. He built a new plant. His ancestors came from Cork. The Fordson surrendered the domestic market to Farmall and John Deere. With Ford gone from America, the tractor market exploded with innovation. John Deere launched the Model A in 1934. It used a two-cylinder engine. It burned cheap distillate fuel. Alice Chalmers introduced the Model U. In 1832, Alice Chalmers engineers partnered with Firestone. They bolted airplane tires onto a tractor. They introduced pneumatic rubber tires to agriculture. Rubber tires absorbed shock. They allowed road speeds of 10 miles per hour. Steel wheels tore up asphalt roads. Rubber tires protected them. Rubber tires reduced fuel consumption by 25%. The American tractor industry modernized rapidly. The machines became sophisticated, multi-purpose tools. The Fordson Model F remained a crude, heavy pulling implement. It belonged to the previous decade. American farmers abandoned it. In Europe, the story reversed. Production resumed in Ireland in 1929. The Cork plant supplied Europe. It exported limited units back to America 10-10-9. The Cork plant supplied Europe. It exported limited units back to America. The shipping costs erased the profit margins. In 1832, the Great Depression strangled global trade. Tariffs choked international shipping. Ford closed the Cork factory. He moved the tooling again. He sent it to Dagenham, England. The Dagenham plant sat on the River Thames. It opened in 1933. It became the new heart of the Fordson Empire. British farmers embraced the machine. The fields in England were smaller. The row crop cultivation of the American Midwest was less common. The standard tread Fordson fit the British landscape. Ford engineers in Dagenham redesigned the tractor. They introduced the Fordson Model N. They painted it dark blue. They gave it orange wheels. It produced 27 horsepower. They improved the cooling system. They added a water pump. They added a heavy cast iron front axle. They increased the weight of the front end. The tractor weighed 3,500 pounds. It stayed on the ground. The flipping hazard was finally eliminated. It took 16 years. Between 1929 and 1932, the Cork plant built 30,000 tractors. The Dagenham plant took over production entirely. In 1933, Dagenham produced 3,000 units. By 1937, it produced 15,000 units. World War II approached. The British government prepared for a naval blockade. German U-boats threatened the Atlantic supply lines again. Britain needed to maximize domestic food production. They needed to plow millions of acres of pasture land. They turned to Fordson. The Ministry of Agriculture requisitioned tractors. The Dagenham plant ran continuously. During the war, Dagenham produced 136,000 Fordson tractors. They built them under the threat of Luftwaffe bombing raids. Women staffed the assembly lines. The Women's Land Army drove the machines in the fields. The Model N saved Britain from starvation. Back in America, the legacy of the original Model F lingered. Despite the danger, the original Fordson changed the landscape. It replaced 2 million horses between 1918 and 1928. It freed up 10 million acres of pasture. That land previously fed draft animals. Farmers plowed that pasture. They planted cash crops. They planted wheat. They planted corn. The price of grain collapsed. The tractor created its own economic paradox. It made the farmer wildly productive. It made the crop practically worthless. In 1938, Henry Ford was 75 years old. He met an Irish inventor named Harry Ferguson. Ferguson brought a tractor to Dearborn. It had a revolutionary hydraulic system. It featured a 3-point hitch. The implement became an extension of the tractor. The hydraulic draft control transferred weight safely to the front axle. The tractor could not flip backward. Ford watched the demonstration in Oakfield. He shook Ferguson's hand. He bypassed his own corporate engineers. He agreed to build the machine. He called it the Ford 9N. It launched in 1939. The original trademark squatter from Minneapolis was long dead. Henry Ford finally put his own name on a domestic tractor. The 9N cost $585. In today's money, about $12,000. It weighed 2,340 pounds. It had 17 horsepower at the drawbar. It had a 3-speed transmission. It had rubber tires. It was safe. It was modern. It was a massive success. The Fordson brand did not die. It lived on in exile. The Ford Motor Company operated 2 distinct tractor divisions across the Atlantic. In America, farmers drove gray Ford tractors. In Europe, farmers drove blue Fordson tractors. The Dagenham plant produced the Fordson E27 N Major in 1945. It weighed 5,300 pounds. It offered an optional Perkins P6 diesel engine. Diesel fuel costs half the price of gasoline in Britain. The European machines were heavy duty. They were built for deep plowing. They were entirely different from the lightweight American 9N models. They shared no parts. They shared no engineering. They shared only a corporate owner. Henry Ford died in 1947. He was 83 years old. He died by candlelight during a flood on his Dearborn estate. He left his grandson in charge. Henry Ford II took control of the empire. He modernized the company. He fired his grandfather's loyalists. He ended the handshake agreement with Harry Ferguson. He locked Ferguson out of the Dearborn factory. Ferguson sued Ford for patent infringement. He demanded $251 million. The lawsuit generated 2 million pages of legal depositions. It dragged on for 4 years. In 1952, Ford settled the case. Ford paid Ferguson $9 million. The company simply altered the hydraulic design and kept building tractors. The new model was the Ford 8N. It had a 4-speed transmission. It had an internal hydraulic pump. It became the best-selling tractor in American history. Ford sold 524,000 units between 1947 and 1952. Across the ocean, the Fordson line expanded. In 1952, Dagenham introduced the Fordson New Major. In 1857, they introduced the Fordson Dexta. They exported them to 100 countries. By 1960, the Dagenham Dexter produced 71,000 tractors in a single year. It was a massive industrial operation. It was also deeply inefficient. By 1961, the dual brand strategy became a corporate liability. The global agricultural market demanded efficiency. John Deere built standard global platforms. Massey Ferguson built standard global platforms. Ford maintained 2 separate engineering teams. They maintained 2 separate global supply chains. Henry Ford IC ordered a complete restructuring. He formed Ford Tractor Operations. He consolidated all global engineering into one unit. He demanded a single unified line of tractors. They called it the 1000 Series. The transition arrived in 1964. Ford retooled the factories. They opened a massive new plant in Basildon, England. They synchronized production between Basildon, Highland Park in Michigan, and Antwerp in Belgium. The new tractors rolled off the line. There were the 2000, 3000, 4000, 5000 models. They were painted a uniform corporate blue. They carried a single white oval badge. The badge read 40, 7 years. It produced millions of machines. The name vanished overnight. The original Fordson Model F is now a museum piece. Restorers paint them gray. They display them at county fairs. The mechanical Widowmaker sits silently on manicured grass. It looks primitive. It was the blueprint for everything that followed. Every modern tractor uses the unit block chassis design. Eugene Farkas drew that blueprint in 1916. The concept survived. The safety record forced a reckoning. The 136 deaths proved that engine torque required mechanical management. It proved that engineering could not ignore physics. The industry adapted. They developed power takeoffs. They developed rollover protection structures. They engineered the danger out of the machine. The machine accomplished Henry Ford's ultimate goal. It destroyed the agricultural draft horse. In 1920, the United States contained 25 million horses and mules. By 1940, the number dropped to 14 million. By 1960, it collapsed to 3 million. The breeding farms closed. The harness makers went bankrupt. The livery stables became auto garages. The internal combustion engine conquered the American farm. 90 million acres of farmland previously used to grow horse feed transitioned to human food production. The transition was brutal, it was efficient, it was permanent. A single trademark dispute forced an industrialist to invent a new name for a flawed machine that ultimately buried the American workhorse forever. If you found this documentary valuable, please like the video and subscribe to the channel.